Today we're going to be adding the pen work to our surreal drawing, and this will take several days for us to complete, but I want to show you how I've created mine from beginning to end. You can see here I have the pencil drawing of this. These images have been traced directly from my found resource pictures, and I'm going to be experimenting with using different types of mark making in pen to help create this drawing realistically. Now you can use either your Arteza pen or your ultra fine point Sharpie for this drawing. Now for each image that you draw and shade in pen, you must work directly from the original resource picture. So I'm going to begin with this bird image, and I'm going to line it back up where it matches my original drawing. And the section that I want to start with, you want to erase your pencil work in a small area. And the reason for that is that the pencil will cover up some of the details in your resource image and you can't see it as well. Now once you've erased a small area of your pencil work, you're going to begin working in pen. And with that experimentation of different types of mark making that we completed prior to this, you want to think about what kinds of lines and marks are going to replicate the texture and create a realistic drawing of your resource picture. So in this particular example of the branch, I'm adding some really delicate outlines. I'm adding some stippling for marks and textures on the wood. I'm looking at some of the shadows and some of the broken branches and knots. All of those little things are areas that I want to replicate and match the texture on. Another thing that you want to take into account with your pen work is replicating the value structure of your image. And a rule of thumb that I use for that is I think in my mind when I'm shading and drawing something, where are the darkest values? That is where you are going to put your pen to paper. Where you see dark values is where you should make a mark. And that's a very simple rule, but it applies to everything you could trace from a resource picture. If you follow that rule, plus the idea of tracing exactly what you see from the resource picture, you will end up with a highly detailed, highly realistic drawing. And it's not about drawing skills to trace. Tracing is simply about putting your pen or your mark making tool where you see lines, edges, and dark values. That's all it is. So anybody can be successful with this as long as you take the time and work slowly and patiently and pay attention to really small, important details, because that's going to give you a very realistic drawing. Now, as you complete one small section in pen and you move on to the next, each time you move to a new section, you want to erase the pencil work and then build up that area in pen. I do not recommend you erase everything all at once because you will forget where things go. So only do this in one small area at a time. And as you're working with your pen, keep in mind that you can use hatching and cross-hatching. You can use stippling. You can use curved lines, straight lines, lines that taper off. You can use kind of broken, dotted, dashed lines, whatever you need to create and replicate the textures. So on the bird, I'm using a lot of stippling and a lot of little small broken lines to create the textures of its feathers and to make it look sort of fluffy. You want to really avoid using just a single hard edge line around the outline of an object because that doesn't replicate or tell us anything about its texture, the line quality of it, or the value structure of it. So explore and experiment with your line work because that's going to be really important. The different types of marks that you use to replicate those textures and those values. And of course, where you need darker values, build up and develop more lines. And where you need lighter values, use thinner, softer, smaller, tinier lines to replicate light values. And the more you build that value structure, you'll see that that object goes from just being a very simplistic tracing to something that sort of becomes more realistic. Another really important thing to keep in mind while you're working is that you want to make sure you give the ink enough time to dry, because this ink will smear and smudge if you brush against it while it is still wet. So do be really careful about that as you're working, and also make sure that you're keeping your paper nice and flat so that you don't add accidental creases or wrinkles or folds into your paper. So let's review the things that I need for you to know about this project. First off, you must trace directly from your resource picture. You cannot free draw anything for this assignment. Then I'd like for you to erase a small section of your pencil work before you add in your pen work. That's going to help make sure you can see your picture with full detail and full clarity. And of course, most importantly, trace exactly what you see. Slow down and take your time. Don't rush and leave out details. We want to see the details and everything rendered as exactly as you can get it. Make sure that you put your pen where you see dark values, and that will help you develop a sense of realism in your drawing. And of course, use mark making to replicate the textures that you're seeing, whether it be short lines, broken lines, delicate sketching lines. Whatever kind of mark would replicate or mimic that texture, that's what you want to use. Avoid using solid, heavy-handed marks for everything, because that's not how things in the real world look. And of course, make sure that you build up and develop your values. Ask yourself as you're working, where are the dark values? And build up more and more marks where you need the darkest values. Now, one piece of advice that I do want to give you, if you're working on an area of a drawing and you're nervous about adding in the shading and the mark making for it because you're not sure it's going to look right, that's totally okay, and I have a good solution for you. Go back into your pencil and shade that area with the kinds of marks you think you want to use in pen, but do it in pencil first and see if you like it. If you like it, you can erase it and then do that same thing again in pen. And if you don't like it, you can erase it and experiment with a different type of mark making. But that way you haven't fully committed yourself to one decision that you maybe don't like. So you can experiment with different types of mark making and shading in pencil before you complete it in pen, just to make sure that you're going to be really happy with it as you work. Now, the rest of this video shows you the entire process of me completing my drawing from start to finish and adding in all of my resource pictures. So this is going to speed up, but I do want you to watch this process because it's going to be really important that you see how I have approached this drawing, especially when it comes to drawing things like the girl's face and replicating some of the textures of things like lace, the flowiness of her hair and the shapes, the line work in her dress, and also the sort of bold patterns of those floral ornate patterns that I have in the lower left-hand corner. So watch the rest of this video to see how I approach different things. One thing you do want to keep in mind as you're working is the idea of contrast. For example, when I begin shading the other bird that's flying in front of her white dress, I want to make sure that I really shade that well because I want it to stand out and be darker than the white dress of the girl behind. And having a darker value of the bird is going to help build that contrast so that way it doesn't get lost in the busyness of the lines of her dress that's behind it. So make sure as you're working you develop contrast. And a good way to see if your picture has enough contrast is to place it on top of a white sheet of paper and then prop it up, maybe in like a chair or up against a wall, and walk a few steps away from it and ask yourself if from a distance, can you see everything clearly and legibly with enough detail from a distance? Do things stand out or do things sort of blur together because they're too much the same? That's usually a good indicator as to whether or not you have enough or not enough contrast in your picture.